Today we are delighted to present Mary Mackey and Judy Wells. Thanks to 2727 California for the use of this amazing space, and to Rosalinda Monroy and Stephen Bunza for their help and support. Poetry Flash readings are held both in person and at various Berkeley venues and online. Videos of our events are posted on our Poetry Flash YouTube channel. To join our mailing list, to receive emails of future events, go to poetryflash.org or sign the clipboard, the analog clipboard, the pen on the end of the table, okay? And then we'll add you to the list. So, visit poetryflash.org to check out our book reviews, interviews, and calls for submissions, and to find upcoming news about Poetry Flash readings and other literary events all over the state. An essay on Alicia Ostricker's poetry by Richard Silberg is to be found on the front page right at the moment, and also a new review of Sonoma County Poet Laureate Elizabeth Herron's new book. And she'll be reading in our series with Gail Enterkin on June 25th at the Art House Gallery and Cultural Center on Shattuck across town, but in Berkeley. If you'd like to receive an email about that reading, remember our analog clipboard. We have books available today for this wonderful reading, new books by both of these amazing writers, ready for you to have them signed. And we also have the featured books available online at bookshop.org/shop/poetryflash, and the proceeds of those profits, not really profits, but proceeds, let's say that, go to Poetry Flash. And I'm happy to introduce to you Richard Silberg, our associate editor, to introduce our poets.
Well, this is a beautiful reading tonight. Two accomplished and also very entertaining poets. Judy is going to read first. Judy, this is Judy Wells' 13th book. I say that with a superstitious feeling, but it's good luck for us. Night at the Musée d'Orsay, and it begins with a poem of the same title, in which a moth is crawling on Van Gogh's paintings and is inspired by the light of Van Gogh's stars. And of course, that moth is a ghost of that very Judy poet who is inspired by the art. Judy is a PhD in comparative literature, as is Mary. So they are Dr. Wells and Dr. Mackey. And this is a grand tour of the European continent. It goes from France to Italy to, I think, the Czech Republic, to Spain. Dale and Judy read at Shakespeare, George Whitman's Shakespeare and Company. Antoni Gaudi is sainted at the end of the book. It's a grand tour. It's a great, and there are also many haikus the whole thing is seen with a bold and quizzical eye, a humorous eye, and an eye inspired by beauty. So let's give her a warm welcome. Judy Wells.
I'm going to read the title poem that Richard so beautifully described, Night at the Musée d'Orsay. If the curators knew I, a moth, was in the Van Gogh room at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris, they'd be shocked. But what do they expect? I love light, and I'm particularly attracted to a painting of stars, globs of light reflected in a river. I've sat on top of these yellow globs and survived somehow, though I can feel the heat of these stars right through the paint. Light bulbs are cold by comparison. Though I'm not singed by Van Gogh, somehow I'm transformed and waves of ecstasy wander through my wings. I rest on Van Gogh's stars all night, and in the morning I flit to a cottage with a voluptuous garden and settle on a deep blue iris. The tourists think I'm part of the painting. I laugh. I'm just a moth with grand taste. I guess I am a moth. This one's called I'd Like to Live in Paris. And it's a fantasy Paris, as you will see. I'd like to live in Paris. I'd like to walk along the Seine, view Notre Dame de Paris. I'd like to live in the 5e, walk down the Rue de Trécole, sit at la Place de la Contre-Escarpe and sip chocolate, shoo away the pigeons Hemingway stopped for his stews as a poor man in Paris. I'd like to live in the 6e, walk in the Jardin du Luxembourg, visit Gertrude Stein's place, sit among her visitors, Picasso's great portrait of her on the wall, Alice with her brownies about to serve us all. I'd like to live in the 16e, or Passy as it was called, in the 19th century. Visit with Balzac in his house where he hid from his creditors. Have him serve me a nightcap of his famous coffee, a thick brew made of ground beans. Then hear his stories toute la nuit, all night, of Esther and Lucien de Rubempré before I waltzed away to stroll around Montmartre with Salvador Dali at dawn. Why not? Or maybe I would join Apollinaire and Marie Laurencin, wandering over bridges on the Seine, the sun rising slowly on a cold, foggy day, my mind jazzed with Balzac's coffee, till I see Notre Dame de Paris and bow my head. I haven't seen Notre Dame since it burned, and I'd like to see it finished, but I probably won't. Here's a little bit more realistic view of Paris at times. Paris, c'est l'enfer. Paris, c'est l'enfer. Et je peux le dire moi, parce que je suis parisienne. Paris is hell, said our taxi driver. And I can say that because I'm Parisian. And yet, the traffic was light in the steady rain. It was the feast of the Ascension, and Paris had emptied its hoards. And no, our taxi driver would not leave town too, but in a few weeks, he would go to Brittany with his wife, une Bretonne. Things have changed, I thought, And I imagined the creamy white, rosy-cheeked Celtic wife with this handsome, dark-skinned, clean-cut North African man. And I slid back into Nice many, many years ago, when the North African Arab men hissed at me as I walked down the streets. Psst, psst, even though I turned around and glared at them. It was their game, immigrant workers without women, taunting a female tourist in the miniest of skirts and a tiny turquoise halter top. The only time in my life I was ever bronze. A skin which later peeled off suddenly in England to reveal my real Celtic white and pink. Today, in Paris, dark-skinned North Africans are still thrown up against the walls and asked for their carte d'identité by la police. We saw it 4 years ago in the metro. But other Arab sons have grown to manhood, like this taxi driver, assimilated and intermarried, though the Bretons too are outsiders with their own language. I wonder now what our taxi driver really meant when he said, Paris, c'est l'enfer. Paris is hell. Did he only mean the traffic, or did he mean the steady, draining rain of racism? Racisme. I'm going to go back to Van Gogh. It's a little bilingual poem here, but I translate as I go along. Van Gogh resided in l'Asile de Saint-Paul de Moselle, an asylum in Provence, Saint-Remy, from May 1889 to May 1890. And there's a Roman ruin next door to this asylum that has a temple to a Roman goddess, Salitudo. And I don't think Van Gogh was aware of this goddess. It probably wasn't even dug up the site yet. But I wanted him to know about it, so I put it in the poem. Asile, asylum. O Valetudo, Roman goddess of good health, you who calmed poor Vincent's mind, calm mine. You who helped Van Gogh produce 100 drawings, 150 paintings in a year, help me produce plus de poèmes, more poems, plus de paroles, more words, more yellow, blue, and green moments of praise to this swirling world of wind, trees, stone, and stars, tourists and cars, art sellers, postcard sellers of stamps, pottery, ice cream, billets, tickets to l'Asile de Saint-Paul, billets, tickets to Les Boris, billets, tickets to Roman rooms, billet to Musée, billet to toilette, billet to the universe. Let all the tickets swirl together into a giant tunnel of plane trees. May they transform into birds, billet to birds to oiseaux, tickets to birds qui chantent l'espoir de l'univers, who sing hope for the universe, qui chantent l'amour, who sing love, qui ne chantent rien, who sing nothing, qui ne savent pas conduire, who don't know how to drive, mais tant pis, but no loss. Ils s'envolent, they fly off, pas de volant, no steering wheel. Ils s'envolent, they fly off, même dans ma tête, even in my head, and express mon désir d'aller là-bas, my desire to go there. Où, comme dit Baudelaire, where, as Baudelaire says, il n'y a pas de billets, there are no tickets. Mais tout n'est qu'ordre et beauté, but all is order and beauty, luxe, calm et volupté, luxury, peace, and sensuality.
She corrupted Baudelaire, wow. That's a high bar.
Oh, yeah, thanks, Mary. Yeah. He was good at it himself. Okay, here's, this is in Italy. It's a more serious one, dedicated to my mother. This is a part of Italy that we kind of know over here as the Dolomites, because people go hiking in northeastern Italy. But it was actually part of the Austrian Habsburg Empire until 1918, where it was ceded to Italy. So it's a largely, there's a huge German-speaking population there. So this is called Procession in Castelrut, the German name of the town, Castelrotto, the Italian name of the town, for my mother. Funeral in Castelrut, funeral in Castelrotto, amongst a people who still celebrate the old customs of Sud Tirol. Men in Tyrolean hats with feathers bear the standard, Jesus, farmer, Christ. The other old men fall in pairs. Younger men in black, Tyrolean jackets, vests, and pants. Green asparagus branches in their hats bear the wooden coffin. How heavy is the Christ man inside? His widow is majestic, held up by 2 adult daughters. A tall woman, small face, elegant brown braids twisted round her head. She wears a long black silk dress with full puffy sleeves, breeched at the high neck, a wedding dress in reverse. Black, black, majestic. She follows the coffin, face a mask of grief. Women now in pairs fall in, everyone reciting prayers in German. Is the whole town here? The little boys in their purple and white altar boy outfits stare at us tourists as they enter St. Peter and Paul's. They do not know I too am here as a mourner, though I wear a blue Gore-Tex rain hat, running shoes, khakis, and green vest. I am here to mourn my mother. I am here in black silks. I am here with the widow and her daughters. I am with them in the small cemetery behind the church. I am with them when the bells toll. I am with them when they throw the last handfuls of dirt on the newly dug grave. I'll be there when the red tulips sprout, the pansies begin to grow. I will sprinkle the flowers with water from the little iron pot. I will light candles on the grave for 93 days. Today is my mother's birthday. Her funeral was 6 months ago. I am here to commemorate my mother. I will wrap black silk around my soul. I will wrap black silk around my soul, so she'll know for whom the bell tolls. So I wanted to read one from Austria proper. This does take place in Austria, but it starts out with somebody else. It's called White Gold. And Austria is known for its salt mines going way back. And even a town, Salzburg, you know, Salt City there. So that's what white gold refers to. I'm also referring to Julia Vinograd. Remember her?
Of course.
Our Berkeley poet who died in 2018. She was almost 75 years old. And one of the best poetry booksellers, except for Mary, I think. Anyway, kind of for Julia. White Gold. One holiday season, Dale and I saw Julia Vinograd trudging up Telegraph Avenue. We stopped to chat, poets to poet. Sister Debbie Vinograd soon followed, pulling a cartload of Julia's poetry books. Well, back to the salt mines, said Julia, and off she went to sell her wares. Yesterday, I tasted what back to the salt mines actually meant to the 19th century women of Hallstatt, quaint Austrian town on the edge of a pristine lake, famous back to prehistory for its salt mines, high above the town on a cliff. On an old sign, I read that even pregnant Hallstatt women made the 500-meter ascent to the mines 2 times a day to bring down the white gold, lashed to wooden structures on their backs. Their babies were often left behind in town with a cloth doll soaked in schnapps, emotionally, physically deformed children, the result. 6 a.m. this morning in Hallstatt. I pull back the red curtains in our chalet room. The lake below is a perfect mirror of white cumulus clouds and huge dark cliffs. Mist rises from the lake. Ducks sail out from the boathouse, leaving a shimmering V in their wake. I wrap myself in a red blanket, go out on the porch. Thank God my task is not to trudge to the salt mines today and return in pain with my load of white gold, but simply to sit on this porch and experience beauty, quiet, and calm on the break of this ordinary day in the universe. I have one here about Kafka, but are there any Kafka fans here? Okay. It's called Bugged by Kafka. You know, the Metamorphosis is that famous book where Gregor Samsa wakes up in the morning and he's a giant cockroach, a big bug. So this is called Bugged by Kafka. 5:45 a.m. I'm thinking about Kafka in Prague, the key to his work. Letter to father, 100 pages never sent, revealing how his father tyrannized him all through his childhood, teens, young adulthood. Oldest son, expected to run the family dry goods business like his domineering, shouting father. No, he would be a writer and a lawyer bureaucrat in a workers' accident insurance company with days ending at 2 p.m. so he could write. Humiliated as worthless, no good, never amount to much by his father. No wonder Kafka's Gregor Samsa woke up as a bug one morning. Kafka's father viewed his son as something to be smashed. I always thought his alienation stemmed from being a Jew. But no, probably not. The family drama says it all. Kafka was not a chip off the old block, more like a speck of sawdust flicked from his father's shoulder. His literary and theater friends were viewed as slime. He could not even bring himself to marry. That would make him too much like his father. Such was his ingrained inferiority, now adopted as his personality. Yet he wrote through it all, followed his vocation, often ensconced in a cottage his sister Otla rented for him, of all places in Prague's castle, in the Golden Lane, number 22. Here he escaped Prague's noise, high above the town, riding till midnight, then descending to one thin-walled apartment after another to sleep and wake to his bureaucratic job, where he was amazingly successful. and often promoted. TB would finally kill him. He asked Max Brod to burn his works. His friend published them instead, and now we have our brooding Kafka's face on postcards and marionettes in Prague, and a whole museum dedicated to his life and literature, where you wander through a dark labyrinth whose walls are file cabinets marked with the names of Joseph K. and Gregor Samsa, and old black telephones are hung on the wall, complete with a German voice on the line when you pick one up. I don't know what the voice said. Something scary and bureaucratic, perhaps, or maybe you're about to turn into a bug when you leave this museum. Or beware the rain. We're about to have a flood, which Prague did along with the rest of Middle Europe a week after we left for home. Vltava, Danube, and Elba, all overflowing their banks. Now settled down, I hope. His character K never did get inside the castle, but ironically, Franz Kafka did, wrote within its confines, not in Habsburg aristocratic quarters with gilded ornaments and curlicues, but in silent splendor in a tidy cottage, an unnoticed bug in a castle, fortified against his father. It's coming up.
Father's Day.
That's a great Father's Day. My father was actually really nice, so taking you to Spain, actually, to Catalonia. And this is a poem, Dale, it's in this one too. Homage to Catalonia. We had been catapulted to Catalonia, Barcelona, and while wandering behind the cathedral, we encountered a cultural crowd sitting in a courtyard contemplating the Catalan words of poets. We commenced into the courtyard, cautiously found 2 empty chairs, and listened to 4 Catalan poets we could not understand. This was not a catastrophe, as we comprehended the emotional content and cacophony of each Catalan poet, whose creations created our delight. The first poet had a formal sound, with regular meter, a conservative approach, despite his orange-pink pants. The oldish poet had mellifluous music in his poems, seemingly long lines and solemn subject matter. Death, perhaps? The woman poet had a conversational voice. I snagged a few words from her confident delivery, Feminism and Simone de Beauvoir. The streetsy guy with the shaved head and ponytail was full of drama and played with repetitive sound. I heard ch, 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 or was it ch, 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 throughout one poem as the crowd cackled. I wondered whether he was playing with Catalan's X, as in Eixample, Eixample, the modernista extension of old Barcelona. You don't say example as in English, though it's spelled nearly the same, but Eixample. So yes, a Catalan poetry festival we encountered through sheer coincidence catapulted 2 American poets into a new language. No, we could not sign up for an open reading, but we threw caution to the wind, said carrer instead of calle for street, but not much more, and courageously embraced Catalonia. Last poem, please. Okay. Oh, those Swiss. Flight to Zurich. Before we take off, Swiss flight attendant comes around with large basket of Swiss milk chocolate candy bars. Yes, take as many as you want, he encourages us all with a broad smile. He's the good mother you never had, the bad dentist, the fairy godmother with the magic wand to soothe your airplane fears. He comes around again before we land, this time with huge chocolate croissants. Oh, those Swiss know how to fly. Even on a 1 hour junket from Prague to Zurich, oh, those Swiss know how to fly. A chocolate high will bring you down safely.
Okay, now to Dr. Mackey. This is her new book, Creativity. And Mary is intensely creative. 14 novels, 8 books of poetry, screenplays, talking creativity. But this is not a general book on creativity. It's the autobiography of a poet with poems by the poet. And it's a fascinating journey. It begins with Mary's extraordinary fevers. She, I think not only as a child, but later in your life, she develops fevers of 106, 107, which most people wouldn't survive. But those fevers put Mary in touch with the creative underpinnings, the larger irrational sources of creativity. And the book is really how to get there, how she got there, the journeys of her life. And it's amusing, she was angry at people who were putting her in ice tubs to, no, because the beauty, the merging, the hallucination. Now later in the book, there's, I may be mispronouncing Professor Schultes.
No, that's right, Schultes.
Richard Evan Schultes, who is the father of modern ethnobotany. And we're talking things like ayahuasca. You know, the psychedelic used religiously. And Professor Schultes introduced her to the jungle, first in Costa Rica. And this book, The Jaguars That Prowl Our Dreams, which we don't have here, but it can be referenced. This is a tremendous book. It's a new and selected. It's a section of new poems in 40 years of previous poems. But The Jaguars That Prowl Our Dreams is a reference to what the shaman feel on ayahuasca. They become ghost jaguars. And the jaguar, towards the end of this book, Mary discovers, she's talking about how poets got to poetry too often through intoxication, through alcohol, through drugs, the kind of suicides, the terrible depressions of poets, and she wants to be a poet, but no for the downside. And she discovers her own ghost jaguars. And so that's a very short, it's an encapsulation of a beautiful creative trip. So let's give her a
Thank you, Richard. Richard gives the best introductions and we've had enough time. That's a very amazingly good summary, better than I think almost anybody's ever done of it. Yeah, this is not a how-to book. This is a book where my search to explain what creativity is. I thought after all these years of writing that I had sort of was on to something about where it lies in the human brain or in the universe. And it's not like 20 steps to be more creative, you can find those anywhere. This is a look at what is creativity. So it's a mixture of, and because I believe it comes from a wordless place, I couldn't very well ask other people to tell me what it is. So I had to interview and interrogate myself about it, really. So I'm going to read you parts of it. It's a very short book. It's only 100 pages. And it's a combination of poems and of thoughts on this. And it is autobiographical, once again, because it traces how I feel creativity developed, at least in me. And I'm hoping it will help you find your path to creativity. I can't tell you exactly how to go, but I'm hoping to give you some directions in some ways. The introduction is just to sort of prepare you on this. What is creativity? Where do creative ideas come from? What happens at the exact moment a creative impulse is suddenly transformed into something that can be expressed in words? To describe creativity is extraordinarily difficult, because the moment of creation comes from a place where language does not exist, and where the categories that determine what we see, hear, taste, and feel are not immediately present. In our daily lives, we tend to live on the surface, unaware of the complexity and richness of what lies below. Poetry creates itself, bubbling up from the depths until it reaches that part of our brains that transforms consciousness into words. Like music, a poem can be understood in a dozen different ways, all interacting with one another. This means a poem can form a continuous bridge between the moment of creation and its incarnation in language. Poetry chose me. I did not choose it. Call it an involuntary act of creation, a constantly surprising connection between self and non-self, a movement from seen and unseen and back again. Call it, at its best moments, the movement of the adult mind back to the radical innocence and vision of the very young child who sees not only the reality we all share, but all those unnamed, unclassified parts of reality we learn to overlook as we grow older. This book's a journey to the place where poems begin. I invite you to join me. Now, this is also, this book has a subtitle where poems begin, and I do talk about that a lot. But I want to say that I believe all creativity comes from the same source that I'm going to try to talk about and describe here. Whether you're a painter, whether you're a poet, a novelist, a screenwriter, a great cook, a physicist. I've talked to physicists about this. I think it comes from the same source. And it's a source that it's hidden in plain sight, that it's all there. And I'm going to talk to you about my first sort of encounters with it. And it starts with, every chapter starts and ends with a poem, or an excerpt from a poem, because I feel like you can't really describe this in words. It's very, here I'm talking to you, I'm trying to describe it in words, but that what poems do, that almost no other form does really well, is contain ambiguity. They contain and present ambiguity. Poems can be read in many, many different ways, and that's a brilliant part of poetry because it contains some of the ambiguity of the universe. And it's something that poetry, I think music does that too, to a certain extent, but in words, poetry is what does it best. And these are poems mostly from the Jaguars that Crawl on Dreams. It starts out with first chapter 2 is Fever. It lifts me from my bed in an ascending spiral, whispering my name over and over, like a disappointed lover. And it's from a poem called 105 Degrees and Rising. There's something different about me, something profoundly physical, yet not obvious. Put simply, in a way that doesn't begin to explain it, I run high fevers, very high. Near-death experience high fevers. This does not happen all the time. In fact, it happens rarely and has never been caused by the same illness twice. Yet in the course of my life, on 7 or 8 occasions, my body temperature has suddenly climbed to 107 degrees Fahrenheit, perhaps 1 or 2 occasions even a bit higher. 107 degrees Fahrenheit, 42 degrees centigrade. Let's pause and contemplate the implications of that for a moment. Brain damage and death occur if the body's temperature stays above 107 for an extended period of time, say 24 hours. At 106, you can experience fever-induced convulsions. This can even happen at 104. The first time I experienced one of these extremely high fevers, it almost killed me. I don't remember any of the details because I was only 6 months old, but fever was not done with me. The next time I nearly died from a high fever, it was before my first birthday. I remember lying on a green couch in an overheated room. As I lay on the green couch, a warm golden light, the kind you only see for a few moments at sunset, flooded the living room. My parents moved toward me so slowly I could see their clothing billow out and collapse in invisible wind. Bending over me, they lost their faces and floated toward the ceiling like huge birds. The Coke bottle on the coffee table multiplied into dozens of Coke bottles, which flew up and circled in a huge glassy aura over their heads. Light weaved around the molding and splayed across the ceiling like spilled glue. Behind my parents' heads, the golden light turned into a veil composed of long, multicolored ribbons that danced in an invisible wind. The veil expanded, consuming the green couch, the blankets, the windows, and my parents. Suddenly it parted, and I saw trees with red and gold leaves, impossible because it was the dead of winter, and little children holding out their hands and calling to me to come play with them. I could never have had much of a vocabulary at that age. Nevertheless, words streamed into my mind and came out of my mouth, combining and recombining into entirely new things. I believe this was the moment when I was given the gift of poetry. I've captured this best in a poem entitled Breaking the Fever. In it you can see the childhood experience I just described transformed into poetry. Breaking the fever. When I was young, fevers were attacked. The grown-ups would rub you with alcohol, wrap you in wet sheets, refuse your blankets, fan you, feed you aspirin, plunge your wrists in cold water. They knew fever had to be fought because it let children see forbidden things. At 105, I would start to hear voices soft and lulling. At 106, the faces would appear swimming around me. Stretching out their hands, they gestured to me to join them. I was always very happy then, floating out on the warm brink of the world. The fever children would sing in high voices, liquid like silver bells. Come with us, they'd say, come play, Mary. And they'd show me maple trees turning red and gold, long aisles of sunlight, and woods that glowed and trembled. My body would start to come apart very gently, like milkweed fluff, and I'd begin to rise up toward their hands. But always, at the last moment, the dark circles of the grown-ups' faces would force me back down, and their fear would pin my chest to the mattress like black crystal paperweights. They would force more aspirin on me, more ice and alcohol rubs, more wet sheets, and if that didn't work, they would lift my naked body and plunge it into a tub of cold water, ignoring my screams. Come back, they would plead, come back, and my fever would buckle and snap like the spine of a beautiful snake crushed under a boot. Then the fever children would abandon me, and I'd be left in a world of ordinary things, light bulbs, used Kleenex, hissing radiators, thermometers. I would see my mother's pale, terrified face, and my stuffed animals, and my brother's crib, and my precious fever would lie broken in 1,000 bits with no way to put it back together. And I could never explain how kind it had been, how foolish we were to fear it. And that is, that's sort of the essence of the things I saw in fever. I want to say, by the way, I've never taken an ayahuasca. I don't know, but what I found when I was the kind of lowly clerk classifier for Professor Schultes, was that I found that, and I audited his lectures on hallucinogens, that I found similarities. And I found these similarities in mystical poetry, But all I can say is that it's, and people always ask me this, it's not the same as drug-induced experiences. It's very different. And something very strange about me, at least, and I have witnesses to this, that I have occasionally, on occasion, when I've had high fevers, you know, somewhere between, 6 and 8 times, it's hard to remember in my life, at least on 1 or 2 occasions, I've talked in rhyme couplets for up to 4 hours at a time, and nobody can make me stop. And I tell jokes, and I laugh, and everybody says, oh, you're dying. They're very upset because I'm dying. And I'm saying, it doesn't matter, really, it's really fine, it's okay. And then you hear the one about, and I just comedy and stuff like that, stand up, I guess it's lie down comedy because I'm very sick, but, that's the way it is for me. Now, I can't say that I don't fear death, some, everybody does, but I've got to say that it's changed it. And, and these have been experiences that have been consistent in what has happened, what I've experienced. And so that is, sort of a major thing in my work. And I think it's, I figured out, and this book talks about that, in certain ways I've been able to go to that place. Not in 20 steps, but in ways that I was able to follow it. I'm not going to read you the general path part, because I could read you the whole book practically every time we have. But I read a lot of biographies of, everybody from, Proust to, Baudelaire, to everybody. And I looked at how these people became poets, and there's an awfully high suicide rate among poets. It's kind of like black lung for miners, it's an occupational hazard. And a lot of it was sort of like, crashing the gates, trying to get there in certain ways. And I can, I'm a very practical Midwesterner. I didn't want to live a life of suffering and pain and horror. I think actually living a good, useful, happy life is more important than writing poetry, So I was looking for a general path, and that's something I talk about. I just want to kind of say that at the beginning. I want to talk about something that I taught myself. Most of this stuff I worked out by a lot of reading and thinking about it. Teaching myself not to see. I want to just show you the basics of that. Once you learn the word for a chair, once you categorize the word for chair, you never see another chair. You just don't see them. They're just around. They're chairs. You look at them. You don't see how everyone is different. You don't see all the tiny, fine details in them. You don't see how every chair in this room is completely different than every other chair. You don't see all the shades of light that twist and turn in this room as you're sitting in here. You don't see all these things. Because once you get categorized and see things like that, your brain is a filter. There's too much information coming in. And you have to have that, or you couldn't exist in society. That's what you need to be saying. You need to be saying. I say it's like a child being invited into a beautiful mansion as long as you'll ignore everything else outside. So to be a sane member of society and not get hit by a truck when you cross the street because you're looking at the mud puddles and saying, look at those rainbows, those are wow, you don't want to. So so you have to have that. It's very important. But something about learning other languages, and I think Judy can attest to this too. When you learn other languages, you kind of get a slightly different view of reality. I'm a little different person, I fancy, this is probably an illusion, that I'm more witty in French, more romantic in Portuguese, more lyrical in Spanish, who knows. But you just get a kind of different worldview, and you find words for which there aren't categories that you already have. And so I think that, that sort of twists it around. So I want to talk to you about not seeing, and I want to talk to you about, read here about how I wrote my first novel, and it's kind of peculiar. So, learning not to see. Okay. And my first novel was called Immersion. Shameless Hussy Press, Alta. Started life as a shameless hussy, and I continued. And to continue. Okay. It's the fall of 1969. I'm sitting in the University of Chicago main library at a small oak table by a large, dirty window that's covered by a hefty iron screen. To my left sits a large, black plastic ashtray, because incredible as it may seem, in 1969, smoking is still permitted in this building, which holds over 10 million flammable books and 65,000 linear feet of irreplaceable archives and manuscripts. Directly in front of me sits a blank plastic notebook and 3 refillable fountain pens. I'm about to do something momentous, and I don't have the slightest idea how to go about it. I'm about to write my first novel, and not just any novel. It's a crazy idea, really, to write a novel that will create in the reader a sense of what it's like to be part of the jungle, to be as inseparable from it as the trees. Is it possible to use words to plunge people into a superorganism of almost 1 billion parts, that's whole in itself and in many ways as beyond words as the language of dreams is beyond description? Is it possible to blend the vocabularies of science and literature, to use the vocabularies of biologists, zoologists, physicists, geneticists, novelists, and poets, and merge them into a single coherent whole, which, like the jungle, is more than some of its parts? Is it possible to create a plot and characters that will encompass these ambitions, for all novels must have plots and characters? I open a notebook and pick up one of the pens. I have no idea how or where to start, so I decide to begin with a description of the ashtray that sits at my left elbow. I will look at this ashtray intently. I will see it as if I've never seen it before. I will view it as an alien artifact created for some unknown purpose. I will describe it so that it cannot be confused with any other ashtray ever created. I will search out, find, and resurrect the way I saw the world as a very young child, a world in which categories did not yet exist, in which there was no context, no expectation, no reason not to look at the unimportant details of things as well as the important ones. Beginning a novel about the jungle with a description of an ashtray may seem like an odd choice. But recently I have become increasingly aware of a strange phenomenon. If you look at any object long enough and intently enough, it becomes incomprehensible. Put another way, it is no longer has a stable appearance, but will shift back and forth, taking on different forms and changing size and shape as you stare at it. I turn my attention to the ashtray and just stare at it, instead of trying to identify it. I try not to identify it. Sure enough, within a few seconds, the ashtray begins to shift and change and become both meaningless, the way the word "the" becomes meaningless if you say it 100 times, and filled with possibilities, the way all objects become filled with possibilities before you file them in the right pigeonhole. A black hole, a void, a revolving wheel, a floating disc, an ink blot on the flat, two-dimensional surface of a tabletop without borders or depth. I believe I'm trying to begin to write a novel by freeing up my imagination from received categories, and indeed that's what I'm doing. But I'm also doing something else, something that will be so central to the way I write poems that it will change the whole way I go about creating them. I'm teaching myself the art of entering a state of hyper-objectivity, a state of extreme focus. I am teaching myself to stare fixedly at the world and expect nothing but what comes from that staring. I believe this kind of hyper-focus is one of the keys to the creation of rich, layered, complex poetry, and also, I hope, will turn out to be the key to a rich, layered, complex novel. Cool, smooth, blank, a hole, a dark spot, shadow of a leaf trembling on one edge. Or do the edges go beyond, out beyond, like auras unidimensional, so where it ends and the tabletop begins? There's no way to tell. And do you have to describe everything to describe one thing? Is there no separation? And for the better part of 20 minutes, I go on describing the ashtray in the most minute detail possible, trying to see it without expectations of any kind. And then all at once, the first lines of my novel appear beneath my hand like a shoal of whales breaching out of the ocean, and I write, Eduardo is drowning, rocking from side to side. He moves like a swimmer, head up, eyes open, fingers pressed tightly together. A neurotoxin is paralyzing his central nervous system, depressing respiration, sending his body into a series of involuntary convulsions. Closing my eyes, I stop the motion, reverse the sequence. I stop and reread what I've written. It's a beginning. This is enough for one day. I close the notebook, pack up my pens, pick up my book bag, and leave the Scandinavian statistics section of the Chicago Library in the great silence of its unread books. I will come back repeatedly, day after day, to write more on immersion, this novel, which I will never outline, but simply watch unfold out of my imagination, like the blooming of a great tropical flower. And this next piece is near the end of this book. So if you need a little background information, which appears in the book. I spent 6 years off and on living in the jungles of Costa Rica before there were any roads or anything. They came in with, I'm not 6 years, months at a time, not 6 years straight. And they came into provisions with by an airplane on a field, like a clearing, that was very small. If they remembered this every 2 weeks. And if you got bit by a snake or something, it was a 2-week walk out of the jungle, so you would never go there. I also have spent time on the upper Amazon. Most recently went back up there in 2015, about 1,000 miles above about 2,000 miles above the mouth of the Amazon, about 1,000 miles above the city of Manaus, where there's a confluence of two rivers. The Amazon actually has two rivers, the Solimões and the Rio Negro, which go together, which form the Amazon. The Rio Negro, the Black River, is wonderful because there's no mosquitoes. You don't get the mosquito-borne diseases because there's so much tannins in the water. You do get black fly bites, many black fly bites, but you don't get the mosquitoes. And that's where all those brightly colored freshwater tropical fish come from, they have to see each other. And there's actually pink dolphins too. It's really cool. You know, there's wonderful stuff. I love the jungle. I mean, I have a lot of poems about it, and I've, you know, do this in French. I have done stuff in Portuguese, but I always believe that if you do that, you need to translate immediately for people, so they know, or it used to be from context. I always try to imagine when I put a foreign language in a poem, what if it were Mandarin? I don't speak Mandarin. How would the poem be for me? So I want people to be able to appreciate it as a chant in the background, or as, you know, actual. If you know Spanish, you get it. If you know Portuguese, you get it even more. But so that's how I like it. And this is called The Mystery of Creativity, and it's just kind of a feeling of, you know, finding it. How I found my themes, my great themes. And my great theme really has been the jungle, and it's very interesting now with you know, climate change and the burnings of the jungles and the exploitation of the jungles. But you'll be happy to know something. On the Rio Negro and the Rio Negro, it's going to be very hard to log because every spring and summer it rises 60 feet in the trees, and there's no dry land to stand on. Only two settlements. I'm 1,000 miles up. There's one small city, Nova Real, and there's two settlements all the way up there because there's no dry land. There's just a few places where people live. The indigenous people are not living there because they're living it, you know, they can't live it. But you can canoe through the trees where all the life is. And I saw more incredible animals and things canoeing through the trees, you know, dugouts up above the trees, than I saw in a couple of weeks than I saw in 6 years in Costa Rica, because all the life is up there. It's like the ocean. All the light is up at the top where all the life is, and then down below it's like a hotel room. You don't really chop your way through a full-grown primary jungle because it's just it's empty. There's not much light. You get big plants here and big plants there, but it's not the hell you see in Tarzan movies. That's stuff along rivers. And this starts with a poem. And I just want to say one other thing. It's something amazing to be totally away from any kind of Western civilization, any kind of human civilization. There were no indigenous people in either place. And to be alone in nature, as human beings probably were alone in nature before, where you're not the top dog, where you're not the major thing, where you're another animal among animals, where you could be lunch or breakfast or, you know, anything else, and where you feel the immensity. It's like, I think, walking among the stars, only there are these great white cathedral-like trees with the beautiful, you know, top way up there with the flowers on the top, and these great immense trees, hundreds and hundreds of feet tall. So it's like walking through some kind of cathedral, and it's a place where human beings have their place in the natural order in a way we never see because we're so involved in technology in Western, and not just Western, but in civilization. The mystery of creativity. Troops of brightly colored monkeys. Troops of brightly colored monkeys hang from the branches of the chicona trees, under the barbona palms. Orange fishing spiders with venom more toxic than cobras are weaving gigantic snares that billow like silver sails. Why these strange creatures? Why this fevered nightmare? The jungle says, "Eu sou grande, I am vast." Você pouco, you are nothing. No one's going to save you. No one is going to helicopter you out of here. In case my Spanish sounds strange, that's because it's Portuguese. A stretch of water lies before me, black and smooth as a mirror of polished ebony. There's no depth to this water, no ripples mar its surface, no school of piranhas rises to feed on living things that tread too close to the border between liquid and solid. Today and all days, here far up the Amazon, 1,000 miles or more from any city, I see only the reflections that reflect themselves and then reflect themselves reflecting. Sky, drowned trees, clouds, air, water, vines, a shatteringly hot sun. I cannot tell which of these things is real and which is the mirror image. I'm lost without a horizon, passing through a world of hallucinations that multiplies itself dream-like on water and keeps on multiplying. I'm exhilarated, almost ecstatic. After an absence of many decades, I finally returned to the jungle. This afternoon, I'm floating on the Rio Negro, the famous Black River of Brazil, that merges with its sister, the Solimões, downstream to form the Amazon River. 20% of the water reaching the oceans of the world flows down the Amazon, and I'm riding that flow, or rather I was riding it until a little while ago. Now I've dipped my paddle and stopped to float silently on the mirrored sky. I stare at the wall of trees that lies some 200 yards ahead of me. The trees look nothing like the towering giants I remember from Costa Rica. How tall are they? 30 feet tall? Maybe 40 at most? Some are so short they are dipping their tips in the branches into the river as if they were nothing more than bushes, but that's an illusion. The trees are huge. Most are 100 feet tall, some as much as 200 feet. And they exist, millions of them exist, in almost complete solitude. No one harvests their fruits or strips off their bark or burns them or clear cuts them for a very simple reason. Every wet season, the Rio Negro floods an area the size of California for months at a time, rising 60 feet or more and sending every living thing that cannot breathe water scrambling up into the canopy. After many years, I have finally returned to the topic, I have finally returned to the jungle that has always been my greatest thing, the thing that took me closest to that wordless whole I had perceived as a child during high fevers. But it had taken me until I was 50 to write more than a scattering of poems about it. Why? Why had it taken so long for me to become a poet, become the poet I was probably inclined to be from the time I was a child? The truth is that now, even now, I don't know. All I can say is creativity is a gift. You can't board it like a bus and expect it to take you wherever you want to go. It's ephemeral, phantom-like, ungraspable, and indescribable by its very nature, because it comes from a place where words have no dominion. Inspiration comes in its own time, often as a surprise, and frequently in a language composed of images and faint suggestions that needs to be decoded. Creativity has an illogical logic all its own. Now as I float on the Rio Negro, about 1,000 miles upriver from the Brazilian city of Manaus, and about 200 yards from the green room of the jungle, I'm finally going home. As I dip my paddle into the black mirror beneath my dugout, a new poem begins to bubble up somewhere deep inside me. Suddenly, a light blows across the water, bringing with it the scent of leaves and mud. All at once, the mirror beneath my canoe shatters, taking the sky with it. And the final poem here is La Reunião, the conference. When I entered the hall, they filled my head with birds, macaws, parrots, chacalacas. I could feel them whistling, crackling, bumping into one another behind my sinuses. The birds sang of love and death, poetry put in cages, people who only wrote to mimic the sounds of their own voices, rich women who tried to buy prizes. But I wanted to hear the sounds of the jungle, the vast humming of sap running through 10 million trees, the slither of the cascabel muda, the hush of a lone dugout canoe riding the current, the silent running of piranhas and pink dolphins, the ancient music of hot nights, drenched and burned, and the trilling of transparent frogs. Thank you.